Racist cop kicks black pregnant woman. Next day, her husband makes him regret it. Watch till the end. Maria's heart raced as she stumbled backward, her hand pressed against her swollen belly. The night air was cold, but nothing compared to the heat she felt rising in her chest. The flashing blue lights of the police car illuminated the quiet street, casting an eerie glow on her and the officer standing before her. "I said step aside." The cop's voice was sharp, his words laced with anger as he shoved her aside. Maria gasped, trying to keep her balance, but the force of his push sent her sprawling to the ground, her hand instinctively clutching her baby bump. "What the hell is your problem?" she shouted, fear turning into defiance. The officer sneered at her, his face twisted with contempt. "Stay in your place," he spat, but Maria was done being intimidated. Just then, a low voice broke through the tension. "You're gonna regret that." Maria's husband, James, had arrived. He wasn't just any man, he was a force of nature. The officer's cocky smile faltered as James stepped forward, ready to make sure the law was about to learn a very hard lesson. Maria had always been careful. She knew the world could be harsh, especially for someone like her. As a black woman, pregnant and alone on the streets at night, she had learned to be cautious. It wasn't just the usual dangers of the city that worried her, it was the heavy presence of law enforcement that loomed over her every move. Maria had spent years feeling the weight of scrutiny, but tonight felt different. The night had started innocently enough. She had been walking to the convenience store to pick up a few things for her unborn baby. The glow of streetlights and the hum of the city had comforted her until the police car pulled up behind her. At first, she thought it was a coincidence, just another officer making their rounds. But then the car stopped, and she felt her stomach tighten with unease. The officer behind the wheel hadn't even gotten out, but Maria could already sense his eyes on her through the rearview mirror. Maria had never been one to shy away from confrontation, but there was something about this officer's gaze that made her uneasy. He didn't just look at her like a citizen, he looked at her like a problem. She tried to ignore him, keeping her head low and her steps purposeful. But the officer had other plans. "Hey," he barked, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. Maria froze in her tracks, instinctively clutching her bag tighter. She turned slowly to face him, her back straight but her nerves on edge. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rising fear in her chest. The officer's eyes narrowed, and a cruel smile spread across his face. "I told you to stop," he snapped. "You got something to hide, or are you just too scared to listen?" Maria's eyes widened in disbelief. She wasn't scared, but she wasn't about to let this man make her feel small either. "I'm just trying to get home," she replied, her voice calm, but her pulse racing. She felt the familiar pang of frustration welling up inside her. She had experienced moments like this before, where the badge held more power than the truth. But tonight, she wasn't backing down. The officer took a step closer, his boots clicking on the pavement. "Ain't no one got time for your excuses," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Get out of the way." Maria's mind raced. She could feel the tension in the air, her heart hammering in her chest. Something told her that this wasn't just a routine stop. There was more to it, and she wasn't sure she wanted to find out. But before she could react, the officer's hand shot out, grabbing her by the arm with a strength that made her gasp. "Let go of me!" Maria shouted, pulling away with all her strength, but the officer only tightened his grip. The crowd on the sidewalk had started to gather, but no one intervened. Fear gripped them all, just like it gripped Maria. She could feel the blood rushing to her head, the overwhelming sense of vulnerability swallowing her whole. And then it happened. In one swift motion, the officer shoved her hard against the side of the car. Maria stumbled, unable to catch herself as her belly slammed into the cold metal. The wind was knocked out of her, but her first instinct was to protect her baby. She fell to her knees, clutching her stomach as she struggled to breathe. "Get up, you're making a scene," the officer barked, but Maria barely heard him. She was too focused on the pain, on the fear that crept in, fear that she wasn't going to make it out of this confrontation unscathed. But then, as if the world had finally decided enough was enough, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from behind her. Maria didn't need to turn around to know who it was. James. Her husband. The man who had always been her rock, her protector. And the one person who wouldn't let anyone, not even a cop, get away with hurting her. James had been waiting for a moment like this, ever since he'd seen the flashing lights in the distance. His instincts as a husband and father-to-be had kicked in the moment he saw Maria's phone light up with a message. The terror in her eyes as she typed, "Something's wrong," had propelled him into action. He wasn't about to let the world take away the woman he loved, not like this. Not ever. The tension in the air was thick, but as James moved forward, it was clear to everyone, especially the officer, that this situation was about to change in ways no one could predict. James's heart pounded as he sprinted down the street toward Maria. He had seen the flashing lights from his apartment window and had known instantly something was wrong. His gut had twisted in that familiar, horrible way it did every time he thought of the risks Maria faced, every time he realized the weight of being a black woman in a world that treated her like an afterthought, at best, or a threat, at worst. The distance between him and the cop grew shorter, but so did the space between Maria's body and the officer's. He saw her on her knees, her hand clutched tightly to her swollen belly. The officer loomed over her, his face twisted in a look that made James's blood boil. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, but it wasn't the time for rage. He needed to stay calm, to think clearly, if only to make sure that this didn't escalate into something that could take his wife and unborn child away from him. "Maria." James's voice broke through the tension like a hammer striking stone. The officer didn't flinch, but Maria's head whipped toward the sound, and for a split second, their eyes locked. Her look was one of fear, but there was something else there, something that told James she was fighting back the tears, trying to hold onto her strength, even as the officer's aggression closed in on her. The officer's eyes flicked from Maria to James, sizing him up as he approached. "You think you can step in here, tough guy?" The cop's voice was low, taunting, and dangerous. "Get back before you get yourself hurt." James stopped a few feet away from the officer, his feet planted firmly on the cold concrete. He didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a challenge to the officer's authority, and the cop knew it. There was no mistaking it. James stood tall, a man who carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from years of standing his ground in a world that often sought to crush him. But it wasn't just his physical stature the officer had to reckon with. James had seen the worst of this world. He had experienced police brutality firsthand, as had his family and friends. He wasn't about to let Maria face it alone. Not tonight. "You're gonna want to rethink that," James finally spoke, his voice steady but filled with an unmistakable warning. The officer smirked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Or what? Are you gonna call your lawyer? Your community? What are you gonna do, huh?" Maria tried to rise to her feet, her knees shaking with the effort. She was still clutching her stomach, her eyes never leaving the officer, but she could feel her body screaming in protest. The cop's hand had left bruises on her arm where he had grabbed her, but it wasn't just her physical pain that hurt. It was a reminder of how powerless she had felt. James didn't wait for a response. He had heard enough. He could feel the air growing heavier, thick with the tension of this volatile moment. This was no longer about him protecting his wife. This was about ensuring that someone would pay for the way people like them were treated. He was done being passive, done staying silent. Without a second thought, he stepped forward. "Step back," he said, his tone dangerous but controlled. The officer narrowed his eyes and took a step forward, as though daring James to make his move. "And what, you're gonna fight me now?" James didn't flinch. "You're damn right I am if you don't get your hands off my wife." The cop's face contorted in rage. At that moment, it was clear that all the officer saw was the threat of defiance in James's stance, and it sent a surge of arrogance through him. Without warning, he lunged at James, but James was quicker. He sidestepped the cop's first attempt, dodging with ease. The officer stumbled, and before he could recover, James grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. The officer yelped in surprise, caught off guard by James's strength and sudden speed. "You're not gonna bully her, and you're sure as hell not gonna hurt her anymore," James growled. The officer struggled, trying to break free, but James's grip was unyielding. His thoughts were clear, his actions calculated. He knew if he let this go too far, if he didn't maintain control of the situation, it would end with them both in handcuffs, or worse. But he couldn't just let this man continue to use his badge to terrorize innocent people, especially his wife. The crowd around them, which had gathered at a safe distance, was murmuring, some recording on their phones, others too frightened to intervene. James didn't care about them. His focus was on Maria, on getting her away from this man before things escalated further. "Call for backup," the officer barked, finally recovering from James's hold, his face now red with fury. "We got an assault on an officer." "Assault?" James's voice was low and dangerous. "You're the one who assaulted my wife, you goddamn coward. If you want to make this about power, go ahead. But it's you who's about to pay for what you did." The officer's hand reached for his radio, but James was faster. He shoved it aside, knocking it out of his grip. "You don't get to play the victim here," he said. "Not this time." Maria was still on the ground, her face pale from the shock of the confrontation, but she could see what was happening. She could feel the rush of adrenaline in her veins as her husband took control of the situation. Part of her wanted to stop him, wanted to keep him safe, to make sure they both got out of this unharmed, but another part of her was proud. Proud of the man who would stand up for her, even when everything was stacked against them. "James, stop," she shouted, pushing herself up despite the pain. "Please. We don't want to make it worse." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. He looked back at her, the anger in his eyes softening for just a moment. She was right. He knew she was right. But he couldn't just walk away. Not now. The officer was regaining his composure, his hand reaching for his cuffs. The situation was spiraling out of control, and James knew this could end very badly if they didn't do something fast. His eyes flicked to the crowd, where a few familiar faces were now gathering. His neighbors. People who knew his family. People who understood the struggles, the dangers that came with their skin color, their lives. It was time for them to step in. "Someone call the damn cops on this pig." James shouted to the crowd, his voice booming with authority. He wasn't just asking for help. He was demanding it. Slowly the crowd began to mobilize. Phones went up, voices rose, and in that moment, James knew this wasn't just about his family anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been oppressed, everyone who had ever been treated like they were less than human. The officer's posture shifted. He was no longer sure of himself. His hand stayed at his side, but he didn't make another move. The sudden awareness that the power dynamic had shifted was enough to make him hesitate. James could see it in his eyes. The cop knew he was no longer the one in control. Then, like the twist of a key in a lock, a siren sounded in the distance. It was loud, sharp, and unmistakable. The cavalry was coming. But it wasn't going to be the officer's backup. It was going to be justice. The sound of the sirens grew louder, echoing through the street like a thunderclap. The police car that had initially stopped Maria now had a new companion, a second squad car screeching to a halt behind it. The officer's face went white, the realization hitting him that backup was on the way, but not in the way he had hoped. James's grip on the officer's arm tightened. His muscles were rigid with tension, but his mind raced, trying to keep up with the rapidly unfolding situation. The crowd was still murmuring, some people still recording, others now more actively voicing their anger. James could feel the eyes of the people on him, and while part of him longed for the calm reassurance of just walking away, he knew there was no turning back. This wasn't just about what had happened tonight, it was about ensuring that this officer, and others like him, would have to answer for their actions. Maria was standing now, but she leaned against the side of the car for support. Her legs were still unsteady, but there was a fire in her eyes, determination, and a sense of power she hadn't felt in a long time. She had never seen James like this before, his unwavering confidence in the face of such danger giving her the strength she needed. The tears that had been threatening to spill were held back now by a fierce resolve. They had been hurt, yes, but they were not powerless. As the second car door swung open, another officer emerged, this one a woman, tall and assertive, with a sharp gaze. She looked over at the scene in front of her, the tense standoff, the crowd, and most importantly, her partner, the officer who had been with Maria just moments before. She immediately assessed the situation, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "You all right, Jackson?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. The officer, who had been on the receiving end of James's grip, didn't answer at first. His eyes flickered to the ground, then back to the woman's face. There was a hint of hesitation, something that spoke volumes about the power struggle playing out at that moment. Jackson cleared his throat and stood a little straighter. I'm fine. Just a little surprised." His voice wavered, and for the first time, Maria saw him for what he truly was, an abuser of power, caught in the web of his actions. He had expected fear, submission, and perhaps even compliance, but instead, he had found defiance and strength. The female officer, who was now standing beside him, turned her gaze to Maria, then to James. There was a shift in her posture, a silent acknowledgement of the power dynamics that had just been upended. Her eyes softened, but she did not speak right away. Instead, she focused on the crowd, on the phones raised and the murmurs of discontent, and it was at that moment that the shift occurred. She understood that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was part of a much bigger issue. James was the first to break the silence. His voice was low but unwavering. "This man laid his hands on my wife. He pushed her down, and he did it for no reason other than his arrogance." The officer who had been assaulting Maria, Jackson, opened his mouth to respond, but the female officer cut him off with a sharp gesture. She turned to him, her voice hard now. "Jackson, I want you to stay quiet." James could see the officer's unease growing. For the first time, Jackson didn't look like the one in control. His jaw clenched, and his eyes darted between James and the woman who had spoken, but he knew better than to argue. Maria, still standing with her hand protectively over her belly, watched as the female officer moved toward her husband. "I'm Officer Daniels," she said, her voice calm but with an authority that commanded respect. "I apologize for what happened here tonight. We'll make sure it's handled properly. You and your wife are safe now." Maria's lips parted, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. The word safe and police had never been able to coexist in her world, but hearing it from Officer Daniels felt different. She nodded slowly, her anger still simmering just below the surface but tempered by a deep relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time in the whole ordeal. "Thank you?" Jackson scoffed, still recovering from the shock. "You think she's going to get away with this? She assaulted me." Officer Daniels turned sharply toward him, her voice icy. "You're lucky she didn't press charges for assaulting her first. You'll be put under review for your actions tonight, Jackson. This is far from over." The crowd around them was now buzzing with excitement, phones still raised, capturing every word. Maria felt a momentary pang of fear for what might come next, but then she remembered the lesson she'd learned from James. She wasn't powerless. They weren't powerless. The truth had a way of rising to the surface, and tonight, it was clear that the tides were changing. As the second squad car arrived, two more officers stepped out, one older man with salt and pepper hair, his face creased with experience, and a young woman whose eyes scanned the situation carefully. They approached Officer Daniels, who exchanged a few short words with them. Their eyes flicked to the crowd, to the phones, to the mounting evidence of what had transpired. It was clear that this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. The older officer nodded toward James and Maria. "You should leave the scene now," he said, his tone softer than his words suggested. "This is going to get handled. You've done your part." James nodded, his stance not faltering for a second. He didn't trust the system to work without oversight, but tonight, things felt different. Officer Daniels had made it clear that she wouldn't be backing down, and that alone gave him a small glimmer of hope. He turned to Maria, gently taking her hand in his. "Let's go home, baby." But before they could take a step away, Officer Daniels called out, "We'll be in touch. Don't leave the city. You'll need to give your statement, and you'll have a chance to press charges." Maria's chest tightened with a mix of emotions. For the first time, she felt seen. She felt like the system might listen. She gave Officer Daniels a nod, silently grateful for the woman's intervention. Then, without another word, she turned to James, taking a deep breath as they started to walk away. As they made their way toward their car, they didn't look back. They didn't need to. The justice they had been denied for so long was finally taking root. The officer who had wronged them would face the consequences of his actions, and for once, the power dynamics were shifting in their favor. The next few weeks were a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and more interactions with the police department than either Maria or James had ever anticipated. But through it all, there was one undeniable truth: they weren't alone. The story of that night had spread, and the voices of the community rallied around them. More people came forward, offering support, sharing their own experiences with police brutality, and demanding justice. Officer Jackson was placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation was launched. And while they couldn't undo the trauma of that night, Maria and James felt a sense of empowerment they had never known before. They had fought back, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever felt silenced, intimidated, and oppressed. James had always believed that change came from within, that it required the courage to stand up and say enough. But now, standing next to his wife, feeling her steady hand in his, he knew that the fight wasn't over. It had just begun. Weeks passed, and the dust began to settle. The emotional aftermath of that night had left its mark on both Maria and James, but there was a sense of accomplishment now, a feeling that they had taken a stand, one that others might follow. Maria found herself reflecting often on what had transpired, on how a simple walk to the store had turned into a life-altering event. What had started as an ordinary night had transformed into a moment of courage, not just for her, but for the many others who had been silently suffering in the shadows. She thought about the moment when James had stepped in when he had refused to let the officer's abuse slide. It was as though he had seen her pain, not as a victim, but as a partner, someone worth fighting for. She had never felt more loved, more protected, or more heard in her entire life. It wasn't just about him defending her I had moment, it was about him understanding the weight of the world she carried, the constant fears she faced, and the fact that, as a black woman in America, she was too often seen as a threat rather than a person. And then there was Officer Daniels, an unexpected ally. Maria had been skeptical and had braced herself for the typical police cover-up, but Daniels had been different. She had acknowledged the power imbalance, had taken action, and had not hesitated to challenge her colleague. For the first time, Maria felt like justice might be achievable, that even in a broken system, there were individuals who could make a difference. James, too, found himself reflecting on the nights of worry, the long hours he spent thinking about the dangers his family faced. He had always known the risks, but nothing could have prepared him for that confrontation. It was the first time he truly understood the depth of the burden Maria carried every day, the constant vigilance, the anxiety that followed every interaction with law enforcement. That night, he had seen it in her eyes, the terror, the quiet defiance, the resolve to survive. And it had fueled his fire. But there was more to the story than just that night. The investigation into Officer Jackson was still ongoing, and the news had spread. The media coverage was intense, and the pressure on the police department had only increased. Jackson had been placed on administrative leave, and the internal review was being watched closely by both the public and the department. For the first time, Maria and James felt like their voices were being heard beyond just their immediate circle. The truth was becoming undeniable. This wasn't just one rogue officer, this was a symptom of a much deeper, systemic issue that had been allowed to persist for far too long. In the weeks that followed, community leaders and activists began organizing protests, holding forums, and pushing for broader police reform. Maria and James had become reluctant symbols of resistance, the faces of the everyday struggle against police brutality. They weren't interested in fame or recognition, but they understood that their story had power. It was a story that echoed the experiences of countless others who had been victims of systemic oppression, and they felt a responsibility to use their platform for change. Maria joined local organizations that supported victims of police violence, working to help others who were navigating the same challenges she and James had faced. Her heartache over what had happened was still there, but now it was accompanied by a sense of purpose. Every time she spoke to another woman or mother who had endured a similar trauma, she felt that old fear dissipating, replaced by something stronger, solidarity. The fight for justice didn't end with them, it continued with every person who stood up, every voice that raised the alarm, and every ally who supported the cause. James, too, found a way to channel his anger and frustration. He began speaking at rallies and in community forums, telling his side of the story, not just about the night his wife was assaulted, but about the deep-rooted issues that allowed it to happen in the first place. It was a new role for him, one that took him out of his comfort zone, but it felt right. He had always believed that it was the responsibility of the community to hold one another accountable, but now he saw that it was not just about accountability. It was about standing together in the face of a system that was often blind to its injustice. In the end, the resolution of that fateful night did not come from the police department's response or the media frenzy. It came from the lessons they had learned, the unity they had found in each other, and the unwavering belief that one act of courage could ripple out to change the world. Maria and James had faced the worst that society had to offer, and yet they had come out stronger. They were no longer just survivors, they were fighters, champions for justice. The road ahead was long, but with each step, they felt more empowered. They knew that the fight for justice didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling and the media moved on to the next story. But they also knew that they would never stop fighting. For themselves. For their children. And for the countless others whose stories still needed to be told. Maria and James stood together, hand in hand, looking forward with a fierce resolve. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun.